The shoes were gone again. Rhea stood on the cold flagstone of her doorway, in her darned wool socks, staring at the empty spot beside the boot scraper, where her only pair of walking boots had sat drying since last night. The morning smelled of wet cedar and goat oat, and somewhere behind her, 3 orphaned wolf pups were pretending very hard to be asleep in their whelping box. In the middle of the yard, an enormous black wolf the size of a pony sat with his tail curled neatly over his paws, gazing at the horizon with the serene innocence of a creature who had absolutely, positively, never touched a boot in his life. Then slowly, deliberately, he turned his great scarred head and looked at the pups. "Bramble," Rhea said, "did you take my boots again?" The smallest pup, Pip, sneezed. The black wolf nudged him forward with one paw, as if presenting evidence. What Rhea did not know, what she could not possibly know, was that the wolf, currently framing a 3-week-old orphan for boot theft, was Kyle Draven, Alpha King of the Northern Reach, ruler of 11 packs, terror of the border wars, a male whose growl had once ended a treaty negotiation before the ink was wet. And at this precise moment, that king was thinking, with the full weight of his royal dignity, "I am not sorry." She was going to walk to the border office today. The boots had to go. He had buried them under the lavender bushes at 4:30 in the morning. It had been raining. He had enjoyed it. He had told himself, 9 days ago, bleeding in her yard, with a silver arrowhead lodged under his shoulder blade, that he would stay 1 night. 1 night until the silver sickness passed and he could shift and walk back to his war camp and have someone executed for the ambush in a reasonable, kingly fashion. He had been wrong about the 1 night. He was beginning to suspect he had been wrong about a great many things. It had started like this. Rhea Marsh was a bone setter for beasts, not a healer of wolves, not a pack physician, nothing so respectable. She set the cracked legs of plough oxen, splinted the wings of the crown's messenger hawks. When the couriers bothered to ride this far out and pulled breech lambs out of screaming ewes at 3 in the morning for farmers who paid her in eggs and firewood, and once memorably a 3-legged goat named Turnip that nobody else wanted. Her own pack had put her out 4 winters ago, quietly, the way packs did it when they were ashamed of themselves. No ceremony. Just a note tacked to her door about territory dues she could never pay. And then a second note, and then silence. And then one morning her name was simply not on the winter provision list, and no one met her eyes at the well. On Omega with no pack, no mate, and hands that smelled permanently of pine tar salve and goose fat, she had walked east until the road ran out and rented a collapsing cottage on Crown land at the edge of the black pine forest. And she had built a life the size of a thimble, and she had made it warm. The night the wolf came, she had been boiling lavender for soap. Her mother's cuttings, the only thing she'd carried out of her old territory, grew in a riot along the south wall of the cottage, and Rhea rendered them down every autumn into hard purple-grey cakes that she sold at the Crossroads market. The whole cottage smelled of it. Later, Kyle would be able to find that scent across a mile of open moor, with his eyes closed. Later, it would be the only thing that calmed him. She heard the pups first. Bramble, Soot, and Pip had come to her a month earlier, the only survivors of a border patrol family, taken by fever, delivered by a grim rider who clearly expected her to drown them. Instead, she had lined a crate with cedar shavings and an old shawl and fed them goat milk off her fingers. That night they started howling, all 3, thin, frightened threads of sound aimed at the door. She opened it with a lantern and found him collapsed against her wood pile. I was the biggest wolf she had ever seen. Black as a chimney, one ear notched by some old blade, and a fletched shaft standing out of his back at a horrible angle. The flesh around it burned grey. Silver. Somebody had shot this animal with silver, which meant somebody had wanted him to die slowly. A sensible woman would have barred the door. A wolf that size could take her head off with a shrug. Rhea knelt in the mud in her nightgown and said, "Well, you're going to have to not eat me. Because there's nobody else out here to do this, and it's going to hurt." The wolf opened one eye. It was gold, and it was not an animal's eye, not entirely, though she was too busy to notice that then. She would spend weeks not noticing it. The eye looked at her, and at the lantern, and at her small, chapped hands, and something in it made a decision. Cutting the arrowhead out took an hour. She braced her knee against his shoulder and worked by lantern light with a boiling water knife. And the wolf shook and dug furrows in the mud with his claws and did not once turn his teeth toward her. When the silver came free with a sound like a cork, he made a low, broken noise, and Rhea, without thinking, did the thing she did for frightened lambing ewes. She lay down alongside his neck, pressed her forehead to his ruff, and hummed, off-key, some half-remembered market song about a fisherman's wife. Inside the wolf, the alpha king of the northern reach thought dimly through the silver fever. When I recover, I will have to erase her memory of this indignity. The wolf, who was older and more honest than the king, thought mate, and that was the whole disaster, right there, before the wound was even packed. She fed him her entire winter store of dried venison over the next 3 days, which he ate with the guilty enthusiasm of a male who had a war camp 2 valleys over with a full quartermaster's stock. She bathed the wound with lavender wash morning and evening, her sleeves rolled up, talking the entire time, because Rhea talked to animals the way other people breathed. He learned that the goat was named Turnip and had opinions. He learned that the tax office in Dun Hollow had sent her a crown eviction notice because the land her cottage sat on had been designated for a royal hunting lodge, and she had until the new moon to file her departure papers at the border office and be gone. He learned this while lying with his head in her lap as she read the notice aloud to the pups in a funny, pompous voice, doing an impression of a royal clerk, and he had gone very still because he recognized the decree. He had signed it in the spring without reading it. There had been a stack of 40 land grants and a war on, and he had signed the whole stack while eating breakfast. His own signature was throwing his mate out of her home. The king thought, I will simply rescind the decree. A moment's work. I will return to camp tomorrow. Rescind it, and this peculiar episode will be over. That was the 4th night. On the 5th night, fully healed, entirely capable of leaving, he climbed onto her bed while she slept, arranged his enormous body along her back like a furnace, put his chin on her hip, and stayed until an hour before dawn. I am guarding her, he explained to himself. The border is unsafe. There were poachers in these woods. His scouts had reported pelt hunters with silver shot, which was presumably who had ambushed him. It would be negligent to leave. A king is not negligent. On the 6th day, she laughed at him for the first time, because Pip fell into the water pail and came out looking like a drowned mouse, and the great black wolf recoiled in fastidious horror from the splash, and Rhea laughed until she had to sit down on the chopping block, and the sound went through Kyle Draven like an arrow considerably more serious than the silver one. On the 7th day, she started packing, wrapping her mother's lavender cuttings in damp cloth, counting coins out of a tin that held painfully few coins. On the 8th morning, her boots vanished for the first time. She found them that afternoon in the rain barrel, sodden, and stood there baffled while the wolf gazed off at some fascinating distant cloud. "How," she said, "did my boots get in the rain barrel?" And Soot, the boldest pup, chose that exact moment to trip over his own paws, and the wolf swung his head toward the pup with such theatrical significance that Rhea sighed and said, "Soot, we do not put boots in the barrel." And Soot, who had done nothing, looked so bewildered that miles away in the war camp, a small quantity of a king's honor should have died of shame. It did not. The king felt magnificent. The boots would take 2 days to dry. 2 more days. That was how they arrived at the 9th morning, the empty boot scraper, and Pip being presented as a suspect. Rhea dug her boots out from under the lavender an hour later, filthy, and looked from the hole to the wolf, and the wolf looked back with eyes like melted gold, and lied to her with his whole soul. "You know," she said slowly, "for a wild animal, you have very specific opinions about my footwear." Careful, thought the king. She scratched behind his notched ear, and the king's inner monologue dissolved into static. Then things became complicated, because on the 10th day, the royal inspector came. Rhea heard hoof beats and came around the cottage, wiping her hands to find a rider in black and silver dismounting at her gate. Tall, unreasonably tall. Dark hair, a scar along one jaw, and a face that looked like it had been carved by someone who was angry at the stone. He wore no crown, gave no title, and said only that he was surveying crown lands ahead of the lodge construction. His voice was cold enough to frost the windows. Rhea was polite, because she was polite to everyone, and offered him goat's milk, because it was all she had, and the terrifying stranger looked at the chipped cup in her small hands, and took it and drank all of it in silence, like it was a sacrament. "This is a tactical visit," Kyle told himself. "I am confirming the eviction has been rescinded." He had rescinded it, in fact. He had ridden to Dunhollow personally and stood over the clerk while it was struck from the rolls, and the clerk had nearly fainted. And now he was here, in human shape, in her yard, on the flimsiest pretext ever constructed by a grown male, to tell her. "The decree has been reviewed," he said stiffly. "There was an error. Your tenancy stands. You will not be leaving." The way he said "you will not be leaving" made it sound less like clerical news and more like a law of nature. Rhea blinked. Then her whole face did something that Kyle had no defenses against whatsoever, lighting up from the inside, and she said, "Oh, thank the moon. I didn't know how I was going to move the pups." And then, horrifyingly, her eyes went wet, and she laughed at herself and wiped them with the heel of her hand, and said, "I'm sorry. It's been a long month. Would you like to sit? I have soap. I make soap. That's not an offer of soap. I just thank you." She pressed a cake of lavender soap on him anyway. He rode away holding it like a relic. His beta, Commander Dane, a grizzled, grey-templed veteran who had known Kyle since boyhood, found the king that evening in his war tent, sitting at maps he was not reading, with a cake of purple-grey soap sitting next to the campaign markers. "Sire, the night sentries report you leave camp every night after moonrise and return before dawn smelling of livestock. I take walks for 6 hours in wolf form toward the east. I am patrolling. The kennel master says you stole a wool blanket from the supply tent. The kennel master is mistaken. It's the blanket, sire, with the crown stitched on the corner, and it's gone, requisitioned, said the Alpha King of the Northern Reach, who had carried the blanket 4 miles in his teeth and left it draped over a whelping box, because the pups shivered at night for the war effort. Dane looked at the soap. He looked at his king. He had watched this male take a spear to the ribs without changing expression. "Understood," he said gravely, and left, and did not laugh until he was well clear of the tent. The stealing got worse. The wolf could not seem to help it. He stole one of her hair ribbons off the washing line and slept with it under his paw, and returned it at dawn, slightly damp, and she blamed the wind. He stole her shawl from the chair and dragged it into the corner where he slept. And when she found it, he had already arranged Bramble on top of it, asleep, so that moving it would wake the pup, which even he recognized as a hostage tactic. He began intercepting her market basket and carrying the handle in his teeth, walking beside her the whole 2 miles to the crossroads, to the open-mouthed astonishment of every farmer on the road, because a black wolf the size of a pony was escorting the beast healer like a footman. Twice he nearly ruined everything. Once when she was lancing an abscess on a cart horse and the horse kicked, and he moved so fast, putting his body between her and the hoof, taking the blow on his shoulder without a sound, that she stared at him for a long moment afterward and said quietly, "No animal moves like that." And his heart stopped, until Turnip the goat head-butted the fence, and the moment shattered. And once when she washed him. The washing. She had decided, reasonably, that a wolf who slept indoors could not smell like a wolf who slept indoors, and one warm afternoon she cornered him with a bucket of lavender wash and a scrub brush, and the Alpha King of the Northern Reach, conqueror of the iron passes, sat in a wooden trough in a farmyard and was scrubbed like a plough horse, while 3 pups watched from the fence in what he could only interpret as mockery. Her fingers worked the suds down through his ruff, careful around the arrow scar, and she hummed the fisherman's song, and he closed his eyes, and the king's dignity and the wolf's joy fought a brief war that the dignity lost by annihilation. If any of my packs could see this, he thought, drifting, I would have to abdicate. Her fingers found the notch in his ear and rubbed gently. Worth it, he thought. Then came the night that changed the shape of everything, and it wasn't comedy anymore. It was raining, a soft, insistent autumn rain, and the pups were asleep in a pile, and Rhea sat on the floor with her back against the bed, and the black wolf's head heavy in her lap, and she was mending a sock, and she started talking the way people talk when they believe no one who matters is listening. There was a mate ceremony today, at the crossroads, she said. The chandler's daughter. Everyone from 3 villages came. Her needle went in and out. Nobody expects me to have one, you know. Omegas without packs don't get claimed. We get offers. Not the kind you say yes to. Her hand had gone still in his fur. When my pack put me out, the worst part wasn't the cold. It was that they did it quietly. Nobody was even cruel to my face. My cousin Sarah just stopped writing my name on the solstice cards. 5 years of solstice cards, and then my name just wasn't there, and I checked the back of the card like an idiot, as if it had fallen off. She laughed, and it was a terrible small sound, and the wolf under her hands lay absolutely rigid, because if he moved, he was going to shift right there and start a border war with her old pack before sunrise. "I don't mind being alone," she said to the wolf. "That's the secret. I mind that I stopped expecting anything else. You know the first thing I thought when the boots went missing?" She scratched his ruff. "I thought good. I thought Now I have an excuse not to go. Isn't that pathetic? A grown woman, glad a wolf buried her boots. The wolf lifted his head and pressed his forehead against her sternum, hard, and held it there, and Rhea wrapped her arms around his great neck and pressed her face into the cedar and rain smell of him. And neither of them moved for a long time. And in the dark, Kyle Draven stopped lying to himself. There was no version of his life anymore that did not have her in it. The only question left was how to confess to a woman that her wolf had a crown. And every night she'd bared her heart to a beast. A king had been listening. Tomorrow, he told himself, tomorrow I tell her. He had been telling himself tomorrow for a week when Thomas showed up. Thomas was the farrier from Dun Hollow, sandy-haired, easy-smiling, a baiter with forearms like bread loaves and a genuine gift with horses. And he came up the east road with a lame gelding and a paper package of honey cakes, and Rhea came out wiping her hands and smiled at him. And from the tree line, something ancient and lightless opened one eye. "Brought you these," Thomas said, "of the honey cakes. My sister made them. Well, I told her to." He had a nice laugh. He looked at the cottage, the mended fences, the pups tumbling in the yard. "You've built something good here, Rhea. Awful far out, though. Winter's coming." He turned his hat in his hands, and there it was, kind and honest and completely reasonable. "There's a cottage empty by the forge. Good village. Good people. A woman like you shouldn't be alone at the edge of the world." He never saw the wolf come out of the trees. One moment the yard was empty, and the next there was a black shape the size of a pony standing between him and Rhea. Not growling, which was somehow far worse, just standing, with its head low and its gold eyes fixed on the honey cakes as if memorizing them for a tribunal. Said Thomas. "That's a large wolf." "He's harmless," said Rhea, with total sincerity, about the apex predator currently calculating the exact legal reach of royal banishment powers. "Stop it, you. Thomas is a friend." The wolf sat down on her feet, all of him. She staggered. Thomas left soon after, with his gelding and his hat, and one uneasy backward look, and that should have been the end of it, except that Kyle Draven could not leave it alone. And the next day, the royal inspector returned to the cottage in human form, cold-eyed and jaw-tight, and announced without preamble that the Crown was requisitioning her services. Royal beast healer. The kennels, the hawk mews, the cavalry stock. A salary that made her sit down on the chopping block. "Why?" Rhea said, stunned. "Why me? You've seen my cottage. I set goat legs." "Your work is known," he said, which was true in ways he could not explain. And then, because the wolf was too close to the surface and the memory of honey cakes was eating him alive, he added, in a voice that came out low and rough and nothing like a clerk's, "And the edge of the world is no place for you." Rhea stared at him. The words were almost Thomas's words, but they landed differently, like something with claws. And for one unsteady moment, the cold stranger's eyes were gold-brown and strangely familiar, and her heart did something complicated and inexplicable, and she felt absurdly disloyal to a wolf. She said yes to the salary. She was poor, not stupid, which is how Lady Isolde entered it. Isolde of the Silverfen pack, alpha-born, sharp as a skinning knife, who had spent 2 years positioning herself as the inevitable Luna of the Northern Reach, arrived at court to find the king distracted, the court whispering about eastward night rides, and a new appointment on the rolls, a packless Omega bone setter, salaried above the master of horse. Isolde rode east herself to look at the problem. She found a small woman in a patched apron, splinting the wing of a crown hawk, with cooking twine and complete absorption, talking to the bird the whole time in a low sing-song. Isolde had rehearsed several cutting remarks on the ride. She stood at the fence and watched, and the strange thing. The thing she told no one afterward was that she didn't say any of them, because the hawk was calm. Hawks were never calm. And her mind went, unbidden, to her brother, dead at 6 in the hard winter of her girlhood, and how he had begged to keep a fallen fledgling warm inside his shirt, and how their father had said, "Silver fens don't nurse the weak," and how she had believed him her whole life since, and built herself into proof of it. Isolde stood at the fence of a mud-poor cottage, watching an omega mend, a broken thing, and for the length of maybe 4 breaths, she was just a woman who had once loved a boy who loved birds. Then she armored up again, because that was who she was, and did what she'd come to do. She was not cruel. She was worse. She was accurate. She told Rhea pleasantly that the appointment had come from the king's own hand, which was irregular, that kings did not salary crossroads healers without wanting something, and that whatever he wanted, women like Rhea did not survive the getting of it. "I'm not warning you off," Isolde said, pulling on her riding gloves. "I'm telling you what I'd tell my own kin. When a king takes an interest in something small, the small thing pays for it." She paused at her horse and added, in a different voice, not looking back, "The hawk. You did that well," and rode away. Rhea stood in her yard with her chest hollowed out, because she had no idea what interest the king could possibly have in her, and the fear underneath it was old and familiar. Everything warm was on loan. The wolf, the salary, the cottage. Loans get recalled. The poachers came 2 nights later, 5 of them, with silver shot and skinning knives, following the same rumor that had drawn their first ambush, a black wolf of impossible size denned near the black pine edge, and a pelt like that worth a lord's ransom. What they found first was a cottage, lamplit, and pups, wolf pups, easy money, in a crate by the fire, and a woman alone. Rhea woke to Turnip screaming and the door coming off its hinges. She got the fire poker. She got between the men and the whelping box, which was never in question, and the leader, a scarred man named Garrick with a crossbow and a smell like tallow and old blood, looked at the shaking woman guarding a crate of wolf pups with a fireplace tool, and actually hesitated, some ghost of a rule about it, flickering behind his eyes. And then his second shoved past him, and Rhea swung, and everything happened at once. The wall of the cottage did not so much open as cease. The black wolf came through it like the end of the world. She had never seen him like this, had never imagined it. 2 men thrown before anyone could shout, the crossbow snapped like a wishbone, and then Garrick, backing towards the door, fired his second bolt, silver-tipped, and it took the wolf through the shoulder, the same shoulder, and the wolf staggered, and Rhea screamed, and the silver did what silver does to a shifter's hold on his shape. He shifted, mid-stride, involuntary, fur running off him like black water, and where the wolf had been, there was a man, bloody-shouldered, gold-eyed, filling her doorway, and he took Garrick by the collar with one hand and said in the frost-cold voice of the royal inspector, "You are under crown judgment," and the poachers, who had just watched their pelt turn into the alpha king of the northern reach, made sounds that were not words. Then it was very quiet. Dane's outriders, who had been shadowing their king's nightly disappearances for weeks on standing orders, arrived to drag the poachers away, and the quiet got worse. Rhea stood by the whelping box, with the poker still in her hands. She looked at the arrow scar on his shoulder, the one she had packed with lavender wash morning and evening. She looked at the notched ear that was now a scar along his jaw. She looked at his eyes. "No," she said. "Rhea, no." The poker clattered down. Her voice came out very small, and then not small at all. "The boots. The rain barrel." Her breath was going ragged. "You buried my boots under the lavender, and you let me scold a 3-week-old pup. I apologized to Soot. I gave him extra milk because I felt guilty." Her voice cracked. "I bathed you. I sang to you. I told you about the solstice cards." And there it was, the real wound, arriving in her eyes as he watched. "I told the wolf everything I've never told a living soul. And the whole time, there was a man in there listening. A king. You sat in my lap and let me pour my whole pathetic heart out, and you knew. And you came back the next day in your black coat and let me curtsy to you. Everything I did as the wolf was true," he said, and his voice was wrecked, nothing royal in it. "It was the man who lied, the wolf never once. The wolf hid to keep you," he said, "from the first night. I told myself it was one night. Then I told it was patrol. I stole your ribbon. The blanket with the crown on it, that was the royal kennels. I carried it 4 miles in my teeth. The eviction was my own signature, and I rode to Dunhollow and stood over the clerk while he struck it. The salary was real. Your work is real. But I did it because I could not stand Thomas's honey cakes. I have hated honey cakes for a month, Rhea, and I could not tell you any of it, because the moment you knew, I stopped being the wolf you talk to in the dark, and became this." He gestured at himself. The blood, the bearing, the crown he wasn't wearing that was somehow always on him anyway. "And I would rather have been your wolf than anyone's king." The cottage was silent, except for Pip, whimpering. Rhea picked the pup up and held him against her chest like armor. And when she spoke, her voice was flat and dry, which was so much worse than shouting. "Get out of my house," she said. "Sire." He went. That was the thing that broke something in her, actually, watching him simply obey, the most powerful male on the continent, walking out of a wrecked cottage into the rain because a packless Omega told him to. I did not go far. That was the other thing. She found him at dawn as the wolf, lying at the property line, exactly 1 wolf length outside her fence, soaked to the skin, and he stayed there, all day, through the next rain. Dane arrived with a tent and food, and a look of profound long-suffering. The wolf refused the tent. Rhea repaired her door, and did not look at the fence line, except that she looked at the fence line approximately 400 times a day. She was furious for 3 days. She let herself be deliberately, because she had spent her whole life swallowing things quietly, and this one she was going to feel all the way through. She said so out loud to Turnip. On the 4th morning she made porridge, and out of pure habit her hands set out the bowls. 3 pups, herself. And then before she caught herself, a 4th bowl, the big cracked one, the one she'd fed the wolf from since the first night. She stood looking at it for a long time. Then she carried it out to the fence line and set it down in the wet grass and said, not gently, This doesn't mean you're forgiven. It means you're getting sick out here, and I fix broken animals. It's a compulsion. Don't flatter yourself." The wolf ate the porridge, with his eyes closed like a man reprieved from execution. It took the rest of autumn. It took him telling her everything, every theft, every lie. An actual accounting which he delivered in human form at her kitchen table in the tone of a war crimes confession, while she drank tea and occasionally said things like, "The ribbon too unbelievable." It took him learning to arrive at her gate and wait to be invited. It took one long evening when she finally asked the question underneath all of it, "Why me?" and braced for poetry. And instead he said, "You lay down in the mud next to a monster and sang the fisherman's song off-key." And Rhea discovered she had no defenses against the truth told plainly. The claiming, when it came in front of everyone, because Isolde forced it, in her accurate way, at the winter court, remarking within Rhea's hearing that the Reach had never seated a packless Luna, and never would. The hall went quiet the way halls do, when blood is possible. And Kael Draven rose off his throne, crossed the floor past every alpha lady of 11 packs, and stood in front of the bone setter in her market dress, and said, in the voice that had ended the treaty negotiation, "She is mine." And the hall shuddered, and then Rhea Marsh, terminally honest, said into the ringing silence, "And he is mine," which is honestly the more embarrassing claim. You should see what he does with shoes. And the Alpha King of the Northern Reach stood before his assembled court and turned visibly red, and the pack bond made its choice in the laughter that followed, which is not how these things are supposed to go, and was exactly right. Isolde left court before the mating moon. At the door she paused by Rhea and said, "The hawk with the crooked wing. Keep it through winter. They fly again more often than people think." It was the closest thing to a blessing she knew how to make, and Rhea took it as one. Garrick and his poachers got crown judgment, mines in the iron passes. The steward, who'd processed 40 unread land grants, got the worst punishment in the Reach, which was reading all of them aloud to the king, with corrections. Cousin Sarah's solstice card arrived that winter, addressed to Luna Rhea of the Northern Reach, in suspiciously careful handwriting. Rhea read it once, put it in the kindling box, and made soap. On the morning of the mating ceremony, in the royal apartments, with lavender garlands on every rail, because the king had personally terrorized the gardeners about it, Rhea's ceremonial slippers went missing. She stood in the doorway in her stockings, looking at the empty place by the door. Bramble, Soot, half-a-year-old now and long-legged, were arranged by the hearth in postures of theatrical sleep. In the middle of the floor sat an enormous black wolf, tail curled over his paws, gazing out the window at the horizon. Slowly, he turned his head and looked at the pups. Rhea crossed the room, knelt, reached under the exact cushion she knew to reach under, and pulled out her slippers. She looked at the wolf. The wolf looked at the ceiling. "You do know," she said, "that I'm not going anywhere." The wolf padded over, and instead of answering, he lay down and put his great scarred head in her lap, the full weight of it, the way he had the first night in the mud, and sighed from his boots. Rhea sat on the floor of a palace in her wedding stockings with a king in her lap and the slippers in her hand. And after a moment, she leaned back and threw them under the cushion herself.